She didn't lose everything when her husband died. She lost everything when she chose to keep living. Loss has a way of arriving like a full stop, abrupt and absolute, as if everything that came before it has been sealed off and everything after it has yet to earn the right to exist. For many people, it feels like the story ends there, or at the very least, that whatever comes next will always be defined by what is missing. Colette's experience challenges that instinct in a quiet but undeniable way. When Raymond died, she didn't just lose a partner. She lost the structure of a life that had been carefully built over decades. The routines, the shared decisions, the sense of stability, all of it shifted at once. It would have been entirely reasonable for her to interpret that moment as an ending, to see it as a point beyond which nothing equally meaningful could exist. And yet, what she demonstrates is something far less obvious but far more powerful. That loss, while undeniably painful, can also serve as a point of transformation if a person is willing to engage with it differently. What makes this difficult is that transformation is not something that announces itself clearly in the aftermath of loss. There is no signal that says, "This is where your new life begins." Instead, there is confusion, exhaustion, and a long stretch of uncertainty where nothing feels stable enough to build upon. Colette's situation reflects this reality. After Raymond's passing, she is not immediately inspired or energized. She is faced with practical problems: financial strain, the loss of her home, the reduction of her life to a handful of possessions. These are not romantic or uplifting circumstances. They are heavy, inconvenient, and often overwhelming. But within those constraints lies a subtle shift in perspective. Rather than viewing her situation solely as something that is taken from her, she begins, slowly and almost reluctantly, to treat it as something that requires a response. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Seeing loss as something that happens to you places you in a passive position, where the primary experience is endurance. But seeing it as something that demands a response, however small, introduces the possibility of agency. Colette doesn't immediately set out to rebuild her life in any grand or ambitious way. She starts by doing what she knows how to do: working, sorting, paying attention. These actions are not dramatic, but they are deliberate. They represent a refusal to remain entirely defined by what has been taken away. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" she begins, consciously or not, to ask, "What can I do next?" The answer to that question does not arrive fully formed. It emerges through a series of decisions, each one grounded in practicality but connected by an underlying willingness to continue. The choice to go to the library, to research options, to look for something, anything, that could be shaped into a new beginning. These are not acts of optimism in the conventional sense. They are acts of engagement. Colette is not pretending that her loss has meaning or that it has made her stronger. She is simply choosing not to let it end her movement forward. And in that choice, something begins to shift. The moment with the ring captures this shift in a way that is both symbolic and deeply practical. For 50 years, the ring represented her marriage, her shared life with Raymond, the continuity of everything they had built together. Letting go of it could easily be interpreted as a final severing, a confirmation that what she had lost was truly gone. But that is not how Colette approaches it. Instead, she reframes the meaning of the object. The ring is no longer only a symbol of the past, it becomes a resource for the future. By trading it for the container and the land, she is not discarding her history, she is converting it into something that allows her to continue. This is where the idea of loss as a turning point becomes more concrete. A turning point is not defined by the absence of difficulty or pain. It is defined by a change in direction. Before Raymond's death, Colette's life had a certain trajectory, shaped by shared decisions and mutual support. After his death, that trajectory is no longer available to her. She cannot continue in the same way, but rather than remaining fixed in that realization, she begins, gradually, to establish a new direction. It is not immediate, and it is not easy, but it is intentional. What makes her response particularly compelling is that it does not rely on external validation. At the beginning, no one believes in what she is doing. The scrapyard workers laugh. The container is dismissed as worthless, and her situation appears from the outside to be one of decline rather than possibility. If she were dependent on encouragement or approval, the story would likely end there. But her motivation comes from something else entirely, a deeply ingrained understanding of materials, of work, of transformation. She has spent her life restoring objects, seeing potential where others see damage or obsolescence. In a sense, she applies that same perspective to her own circumstances. This is an important aspect of how loss becomes a turning point. It requires a shift not just in what you do, but in how you see. Colette does not deny the reality of her situation. She acknowledges the loss fully, the absence of Raymond, the financial strain, the uncertainty. But she does not allow that reality to define the limits of what is possible. Instead, she looks at what remains and asks what can be made from it. This is not an easy mindset to adopt. It requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without letting it dictate every decision. As she begins working on the container, the transformation is not immediate or dramatic. It starts with cleaning, with clearing out what is no longer useful. This process mirrors, in a subtle way, the internal work of moving through loss. Before something new can be built, space has to be created. Old structures, whether physical or emotional, need to be examined and, in some cases, removed. Colette approaches this with the same steady focus she brings to everything else. She does not rush. She does not try to skip steps. She works through it piece by piece. Over time, these small, consistent actions accumulate into something larger. The container begins to change, the space becomes defined, the vision takes shape. What was once dismissed as worthless starts to reveal its potential, and in that process, Colette's own situation begins to shift as well. She is no longer simply someone who has lost everything. She becomes someone who is building something new. The loss has not disappeared, but it has been integrated into a larger narrative, one that includes creation as well as absence. This is the essence of a turning point. It is not a single moment where everything changes instantly. It is a gradual reorientation, a series of choices that, over time, lead in a different direction. Colette's story illustrates that this kind of change is possible even under difficult circumstances, even later in life, even without external support. It does not require extraordinary luck or resources. It requires a willingness to continue, to engage, to act, even when the outcome is uncertain. What makes this perspective valuable is that it offers an alternative to the idea that loss must always be purely destructive. It acknowledges the pain and the difficulty, but it also leaves room for the possibility that something else can emerge from it. Not something that replaces what was lost, but something that grows alongside it, shaped by it, informed by it. In this way, loss becomes not just an ending, but a point of transition, a place where the direction of a life can change, sometimes in ways that were not visible before. When circumstances fall apart, people often assume that everything valuable has been lost along with them. There's a natural tendency to tie worth to stability, income, property, routine, structure. When those disappear, it can feel as though nothing solid remains. But Colette's experience reveals a different layer of reality, one that becomes visible only when the external framework is stripped away. What remained with her, even after the house, the savings, and the familiar rhythms of her life were gone, was something far more durable: her ability to work with her hands, to see potential in materials, and to bring something meaningful into existence through skill and attention. This distinction between what is owned and what is embodied is easy to overlook when life is comfortable. Skills often sit quietly in the background, taken for granted because they are always available. They don't demand recognition in the way financial assets or physical possessions do, but when everything else is removed, they become visible in a way that is impossible to ignore. Colette did not have access to wealth or security in the traditional sense, but she had decades of accumulated experience, an understanding of materials, a sensitivity to form, a patience for process. These were not things that could be taken from her. They were not dependent on her environment. They existed within her, ready to be used in whatever context she found herself. What makes this particularly significant is that these skills were not acquired with the expectation that they would one day serve as her primary means of survival. They were developed gradually, over years of consistent practice, often in the background of a life that seemed stable and predictable. Restoration work, attention to detail, the ability to see beyond the current state of an object, these were simply part of how she moved through the world. They were not treated as extraordinary or strategic. And yet, when her circumstances changed, they became the foundation upon which everything else could be built. This highlights an important truth about capability. It compounds quietly over time. Unlike money, which can fluctuate or disappear, skill deepens through use and remains accessible regardless of external conditions. It adapts. It travels with you. It does not require permission or ideal circumstances to be applied. Colette did not need a fully equipped workshop or a formal business structure to begin working. She started with what she had: basic tools, a willingness to learn what she didn't yet know, and a clear understanding of how to approach a problem step by step. The container itself becomes a kind of canvas for this principle. To most people, it appears as a failed object, damaged, rusted, no longer serving its original purpose. But Colette's ability allows her to interpret it differently. She does not see only what it is, she sees what it can become. This is not guesswork or blind optimism. It is informed by years of experience, by countless hours spent restoring and reimagining objects that others had discarded. Her vision is grounded in knowledge. She understands the properties of the material, the structural possibilities, the way light interacts with surfaces. This understanding gives her a kind of confidence that does not depend on external validation. When she begins the process of transforming the container, the work itself reinforces the value of her skills. Cleaning, repairing, cutting, assembling, each step requires precision and patience. There is no shortcut. There is no way to bypass the process and arrive directly at the result. What she has is the ability to move through that process effectively, to make decisions based on experience rather than guesswork. This is where skill reveals its true nature. It is not just about knowing how to do something. It is about knowing how to approach something unfamiliar with a sense of direction. Another important aspect of skill is that it builds resilience without needing to declare it. Colette does not describe herself as resilient. She does not frame her actions in terms of strength or perseverance. She simply works. But within that work is a kind of stability that does not depend on her circumstances improving immediately. The act of making something, of engaging with a task that has a clear beginning and end, provides a structure that her external life no longer offers. It gives her a way to move forward without needing to solve everything at once. This is particularly relevant in situations where uncertainty is high. When the future is unclear, it is easy to become paralyzed by the scale of the unknown. Skills offer a way to bypass that paralysis. They allow you to focus on what can be done now, with what is available. Colette does not need to know exactly how the container will be received or what it will eventually become. She only needs to know how to take the next step, how to clean, how to repair, how to install, how to shape. Each action builds on the last, creating momentum where there was none. There is also a deeper psychological element at play. Skills reinforce a sense of identity that is not tied to external labels. Colette is not defined by her financial situation, her housing status, or even her loss. She is defined, in a very real sense, by what she can do. This provides a kind of continuity that is especially valuable in times of change. Even when everything else shifts, she remains someone who can work with materials, who can create, who can solve problems. This continuity makes it possible for her to move forward without feeling as though she has become someone entirely new or unrecognizable. As the project progresses, the impact of her skills begins to extend beyond her immediate situation. What she creates starts to attract attention, not because it is designed to impress, but because it is done well. The quality of her work speaks for itself. This is another important characteristic of skill. It communicates. It does not need to be explained or justified. When something is built with care and understanding, it carries that evidence within it. People respond to it, often without fully articulating why. This response creates opportunities that would not have been accessible otherwise. The attention from designers, the interest from visitors, the commissions that begin to arrive, all of these are direct results of the work she has done. They are not based on her circumstances or her story alone. They are based on the tangible outcome of her effort and ability. This reinforces the idea that skill is not just a means of coping, it is a means of creating value in a very practical sense. What makes this particularly meaningful is that it does not require a complete reinvention. Colette does not have to become someone else to succeed in her new situation. She does not need to adopt a different identity or pursue an entirely new path. She builds on what she already knows, adapting it to a new context. This makes the transition more sustainable. It is not driven by urgency or desperation alone, but by a genuine alignment between her abilities and her actions. Over time, this alignment becomes the basis for a new kind of stability. It may not look the same as the stability she had before, but it is no less real. It is built on something that cannot be easily taken away, something that grows stronger with use rather than diminishing. Her work becomes both a source of income and a source of meaning, not because it was intended to fulfill both roles, but because it naturally does so when approached with care and consistency. In a broader sense, this idea challenges the way people think about security. It suggests that true security is not found solely in what you possess, but in what you are capable of doing. Possessions can provide comfort and convenience, but they are inherently vulnerable to change. Skills, on the other hand, provide a kind of independence. They allow you to respond to changing circumstances with a degree of control, even when those circumstances are not ideal. Colette's story does not imply that skills eliminate hardship or guarantee success. The work is still difficult, the process still uncertain, the outcome still dependent on many factors beyond her control. But what it does show is that skills create possibilities where there might otherwise be none. They offer a way forward, a set of tools that can be applied in different contexts, adapted to new challenges, and relied upon when other forms of support are no longer available. In the end, what remains most significant is not just that Colette was able to rebuild her life, but how she did it. She did not rely on external rescue or sudden opportunity. She relied on what she had developed over time, often without realizing how essential it would become. Her skills did not just help her survive her circumstances. They allowed her to shape them, to transform them into something that reflected her understanding, her effort, and her vision. Value is often treated as something fixed, something that exists independently of the person observing it. A piece of land is either useful or it is. An object is either worth something or it is. This way of thinking is efficient, but it is also limited. It assumes that value is inherent and universally recognized, rather than something that can be shaped by perception, context, and intention. Colette's experience quietly challenges this assumption. When she stood in that scrapyard looking at a rusted container on a rocky, uneven lot, she was not seeing the same thing everyone else saw. The difference was not in the object itself. The container was exactly as it appeared, damaged, neglected, written off. The difference was in how she interpreted it. What most people saw was the current state of the container. They saw rust, structural wear, inconvenience, and cost. Their assessment was based on what the container had been and what it no longer was. From that perspective, their conclusion made sense. It had lost its original function, and restoring it to that function would require effort that did not seem justified by the outcome. But Colette was not focused on its past role. She was focused on its potential. This shift in focus is subtle, but it changes everything. Instead of asking what the container is worth in its current state, she asks what it could become if approached differently. This way of seeing is not accidental. It is the result of years spent working with objects that others had discarded. In restoration work, value is rarely obvious at first glance. It is something that has to be uncovered, sometimes literally, through cleaning, repairing, and reimagining. Over time, this process trains the mind to look beyond surface conditions. Damage becomes information rather than disqualification. Wear becomes texture rather than flaw. The question shifts from, is this valuable, to what kind of value could this hold? Colette brings this mindset with her into the scrapyard, and it allows her to see an opportunity where others see a burden. The land itself is another example of this principle. It is described as rocky, uneven, and difficult to work with. These characteristics are enough to discourage most potential buyers, especially those looking for something immediately usable. But Colette's attention moves to a different detail, the location of the lot in relation to the planned trail. This is not something visible in the physical condition of the land. It requires information, research, and the ability to connect separate pieces of knowledge into a larger picture. The land is not valuable because of what it currently offers. It is valuable because of what it will eventually connect to. This kind of insight transforms the assessment of the entire property. What becomes clear is that value is not just about the object or the land itself. It is about the relationship between the object and the person engaging with it. Two people can look at the same thing and arrive at completely different conclusions, not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because they are asking different questions. Most of the people at the auction are asking whether the container is worth their time in its current state. Colette is asking whether it can become something worth having. That difference in perspective creates a difference in outcome. This idea extends beyond physical objects. It applies to situations, opportunities, and even people. When something is labeled as worthless, it is often because it does not fit within a particular framework of usefulness. It does not meet the criteria that most people are using to evaluate it, but those criteria are not absolute. They are shaped by context, by experience, by expectations. Change the context, and the value can change as well. Colette does exactly this. She does not try to force the container into its original role. She changes the role entirely. She redefines what the container is for, and in doing so, she redefines its value. This process requires a certain kind of patience. It is not enough to simply imagine a different outcome. That vision has to be translated into reality through consistent effort. The container does not become valuable the moment Colette decides it is. It becomes valuable through the work she puts into it, the cleaning, the structural modifications, the careful integration of materials. Each step adds something, not just in terms of physical improvement, but in terms of meaning. The object begins to carry evidence of intention, of thought, of care. These qualities are not immediately visible, but they are felt. They change how others perceive the space when they encounter it. What is particularly interesting is how this transformation affects the perception of others over time. At the beginning, the container is dismissed. It is laughed at, ignored, overlooked. But as the work progresses and the final result begins to take shape, that perception shifts. People start to see what Colette saw, not because the container has become something entirely different, but because its potential has been realized. The rust is still there. The structure is still industrial. But now those same qualities are interpreted differently. The rust becomes texture, the industrial form becomes aesthetic, the location becomes strategic. The object has not changed in essence, but its meaning has. This highlights an important aspect of value creation. It often requires someone to act first, before there is any external validation. If Colette had waited for others to recognize the potential of the container, she would have waited indefinitely. The value was not visible until it was created. This is a common pattern in many areas of life. Opportunities are rarely labeled as such in advance. They often appear in forms that are unappealing, inconvenient, or difficult to understand. Recognizing them requires a willingness to look beyond immediate appearances and to trust one's own judgment. There is also a risk involved in this process. Not every overlooked object or situation can be transformed into something valuable. The ability to see potential does not guarantee success. It has to be paired with the ability to execute, to follow through, to adapt when things do not go as planned. Colette's success is not just the result of her vision, but of her skill and persistence. She does not rely on the idea alone. She commits to the work required to make it real. This combination of perception and action is what ultimately creates value. Another layer to consider is how this transformation influences the environment around it. Once the container becomes something noteworthy, it changes the way the surrounding area is perceived. The same road that people once passed without noticing becomes a destination. The same trail becomes associated with a unique landmark. Value begins to spread outward, affecting not just the original object, but everything connected to it. This is a powerful effect. It shows that creating value in one place can elevate the perception of an entire context. This ripple effect also reinforces the idea that value is not static. It evolves. It responds to changes in use, in perception, in context. What is considered worthless at one point can become desirable at another, not because its fundamental nature has changed, but because the way it is understood has shifted. Colette's project accelerates this shift. It provides a clear example of what is possible, and in doing so, it invites others to reconsider their own assumptions about value. At a deeper level, this way of thinking requires a certain independence of mind. It means being willing to trust one's own assessment even when it differs from the majority. This is not about ignoring other perspectives entirely, but about recognizing that consensus is not always an accurate measure of potential. The crowd at the auction is not wrong in a general sense. They are operating within a framework that makes sense for their needs and expectations. But that framework does not account for what Colette is trying to do. Her vision exists outside of it, and she is willing to act on that vision without needing it to be confirmed in advance. This independence is not loud or confrontational. It is quiet and steady. Colette does not argue with the people who laugh. She does not try to convince them that they are mistaken. She simply proceeds with her plan. This approach allows her to focus her energy on the work itself rather than on defending her perspective. Over time, the results speak more effectively than any explanation could. What emerges from all of this is a broader understanding of how value is created. It is not simply discovered or inherited. It is shaped through perception, informed by experience, and realized through action. It requires the ability to look beyond what is immediately visible and to imagine what could exist in its place. It requires the discipline to bring that vision into reality, step by step, without relying on immediate recognition or reward. In Colette's case, this process transforms not just an object, but an entire situation. What begins as a desperate or uncertain decision becomes the foundation for something meaningful and sustainable. The container, once dismissed, becomes a place that draws people, that generates interest, that creates opportunities. Its value is no longer questioned. It is evident in the way people respond to it, in the way it functions, in the role it plays in the community. This transformation serves as a reminder that value is not always where it is expected to be. It does not always appear in polished, ready-made forms. Sometimes it exists in places that require effort to uncover, in objects that require work to restore, in situations that require patience to understand. Recognizing it is the first step, but creating it is what ultimately makes the difference. Courage is often imagined as something dramatic, a visible act that announces itself with certainty and force. It is associated with bold decisions, public declarations, and moments that can be clearly identified as turning points. But in reality, courage rarely appears in such obvious forms. More often, it exists in quieter, less noticeable actions, decisions made without certainty, steps taken without applause, efforts sustained without immediate reward. Colette's experience reflects this quieter version of courage, one that does not rely on intensity or recognition, but on consistency. What makes this kind of courage difficult to recognize is that it does not feel extraordinary while it is happening. It does not come with a sense of confidence or clarity. In fact, it often exists alongside doubt, fatigue, and uncertainty. When Colette begins her work on the container, she is not driven by a surge of inspiration or a belief that everything will work out. She is responding to necessity, to the reality of her situation. But within that response is a choice, to keep moving, to engage with what is in front of her rather than retreat from it. That choice, repeated over time, becomes the foundation of her progress. The idea of courage as consistency challenges the assumption that strength must be visible to be real. There is nothing outwardly dramatic about cleaning a space for 3 days, about removing debris, about preparing a surface for what will come next. These are tasks that require effort, but they do not attract attention. They are not the kind of actions that people typically associate with bravery, and yet they are essential. Without them, nothing else can happen. Colette's willingness to begin with these basic steps, without knowing exactly where they will lead, demonstrates a form of courage that is grounded in action rather than emotion. This kind of courage is closely tied to discipline. It is not about feeling ready or motivated. It is about doing what needs to be done regardless of how one feels in the moment. Colette does not wait for the right mindset to begin her work. She starts where she is, with what she has. This approach removes the pressure to achieve a certain emotional state before taking action. It allows progress to occur even in the presence of doubt or discomfort. Over time, this consistency builds momentum, creating a sense of movement that can carry a person through periods of uncertainty. Another important aspect of quiet courage is its relationship to time. Dramatic acts are often immediate and finite. They occur in a specific moment and are then complete. Consistent courage, on the other hand, unfolds over an extended period. It requires sustained effort, repeated choices, and a willingness to continue even when results are not yet visible. Colette's project does not come together overnight. It develops gradually, through a series of steps that may not seem significant on their own, but collectively create something substantial. This gradual process can be challenging because it does not provide instant feedback. There are long stretches where the outcome is unclear, where the work feels incomplete, where progress is difficult to measure. In these moments, it would be easy to stop, to question the direction, to abandon the effort altogether. What allows Colette to continue is not certainty about the final result, but a commitment to the process itself. She trusts the work, even when the outcome is not yet fully defined. This trust is not blind. It is informed by experience, by a lifetime of working with materials and understanding how transformation occurs. She knows that meaningful change takes time, that surfaces must be prepared before they can be finished, that structures must be stabilized before they can be opened. This knowledge provides a framework that supports her consistency. It gives her a reason to continue, even when the immediate results are not visible. Quiet courage also involves a certain level of independence. It requires the ability to act without relying on external validation. At the beginning of her project, Colette does not receive encouragement or support from those around her. In fact, she encounters skepticism and dismissal. The container is seen as a poor investment, the land as unusable. If she were dependent on approval, these reactions might have been enough to stop her. But her motivation comes from a different place. It is rooted in her own understanding of what she is doing and why. This independence does not mean isolation. Colette does accept help when it is offered, whether from Tom or from Petra, but her willingness to accept assistance does not replace her own responsibility for the work. She remains engaged, involved, and accountable for each step of the process. This balance between independence and collaboration allows her to move forward without becoming dependent on others to sustain her momentum. There is also an element of humility in this kind of courage. It does not seek recognition or attention. It does not require acknowledgement to continue. Colette does not approach her project as something that needs to be seen or admired. She approaches it as something that needs to be done correctly. Her focus is on the quality of the work, on the integrity of the process, rather than on how it will be perceived. This focus allows her to maintain consistency without being distracted by external expectations. As the project progresses and the container begins to attract attention, the perception of her work changes. What was once dismissed becomes admired, but this shift in perception does not alter the nature of her effort. The same consistency that defined her work at the beginning continues to define it as it gains recognition. This continuity is important. It shows that her courage was not dependent on the outcome. It was present from the start, in the decision to begin and in the commitment to continue. Another dimension of quiet courage is its adaptability. It does not follow a rigid plan. It responds to changing circumstances, to new information, to unexpected challenges. Colette's project involves learning new tools, adjusting her approach, solving problems as they arise. Each of these moments requires a decision, to engage with the difficulty rather than avoid it. This willingness to adapt is a form of courage in itself. It acknowledges that uncertainty is part of the process, and that progress often depends on the ability to respond effectively to it. This adaptability also reinforces the idea that courage is not a single trait but a series of actions. It is not something that a person either has or does not have. It is something that is expressed through behavior, through choices made over time. Colette's actions demonstrate this clearly. She does not rely on a fixed sense of confidence. She builds confidence through action, through the repeated experience of engaging with challenges and finding ways to move through them. The cumulative effect of these small, consistent actions is significant. What begins as a series of modest efforts becomes a substantial achievement. The container is transformed, the space is redefined, the project gains recognition. But none of this would have been possible without the underlying consistency that sustained the work from the beginning. This is the essence of quiet courage. It does not seek to impress, it seeks to endure. In a broader sense, this understanding of courage has practical implications. It suggests that meaningful change does not require extraordinary circumstances or dramatic interventions. It can begin with small actions, taken consistently over time. It can be sustained through discipline, supported by experience, and guided by a clear sense of purpose. This makes it more accessible. It does not depend on rare opportunities or exceptional moments. It depends on the willingness to continue, even when the path is not fully visible. Colette's story illustrates that this kind of courage is not only effective but also sustainable. It allows for progress without burnout, for adaptation without loss of direction, for growth without the need for constant validation. It aligns with the reality of most challenges, which are not resolved in a single moment but worked through over time. By focusing on consistency rather than intensity, it provides a model for approaching difficulty that is both realistic and resilient. What emerges is a redefinition of courage, one that is less about dramatic action and more about steady engagement. It is the courage to begin without certainty, to continue without recognition, to adapt without losing focus. It is the courage to do the work, day after day, without needing it to feel extraordinary. And in that consistency, something meaningful takes shape, not all at once, but gradually, through the accumulation of effort and the persistence of intention. Moving forward after loss is often misunderstood as an act of forgetting, as if continuing with life requires leaving behind what once mattered most. Many people quietly carry the belief that holding on to the past means staying still, and that stepping into the future means letting go completely. Colette's story offers a more honest and nuanced perspective. She does not move forward by abandoning her past, nor does she remain trapped in it. Instead, she finds a way to carry it with her in a form that allows her to keep living, building, and creating. When Raymond dies, what disappears is not just his physical presence, but the shared rhythm of their life. The routines, the conversations, the silent understanding between two people who have spent decades together. Those things do not have replacements. They leave a space that cannot be filled in the same way. Colette does not attempt to fill that space with something new or pretend that it no longer exists. She acknowledges it, lives with it, and gradually learns how to move alongside it rather than against it. This is where the idea of honoring the past becomes important. Honoring does not mean preserving everything exactly as it was. It does not mean holding on to every object, every habit, every physical reminder. In fact, sometimes honoring requires letting go of those things so that what truly matters can continue in a different form. The decision to give up the ring is a clear example of this. On the surface, it looks like a loss, like the final separation from something deeply meaningful. But in reality, it is an act of transformation. The ring does not lose its meaning changes. It becomes part of a new beginning rather than a symbol of something that can no longer be. What makes this decision powerful is not just the act itself, but the intention behind it. Colette does not let go of the ring because she no longer values it. She lets go of it because she understands that its value can be used in a way that allows her to continue living fully. In this sense, she is not turning away from her past. She is using it as a foundation for her future. The love, the shared experiences, the skills she developed alongside Raymond, all of these remain with her. They are not tied to a single object. They exist within her, shaping her actions and her choices. This internalization of the past is what allows her to move forward without feeling disconnected from it. When she begins working on the container, she is not starting from zero. She brings with her everything she learned during her years with Raymond. The way she approaches materials, the way she thinks about structure, the patience she applies to her work, these are all influenced by the life they built together. In a very real sense, Raymond's presence continues through her actions. Not as a memory that holds her back, but as a source of guidance that moves her forward. This shift from external to internal is a key part of the process. As long as meaning is attached only to physical objects or specific circumstances, it can feel fragile. When those objects are lost or those circumstances change, it can seem as though the meaning is lost as well. But when meaning is carried internally, it becomes more stable. It can adapt to new situations, take on new forms, and continue to exist even when the external conditions are different. Colette's use of Raymond's tools illustrates this idea clearly. She does not keep them as untouchable relics, preserved for memory alone. She uses them. She integrates them into her daily work, allowing them to remain active rather than static. This choice reflects a deeper understanding of what it means to carry something forward. It is not about holding on in a way that prevents change. It is about allowing what was meaningful to continue being meaningful in a new context. There is also a certain courage in this approach. It would be easier in some ways to hold on tightly to everything that remains, to avoid making decisions that feel like further loss. But that kind of holding on can become limiting. It can prevent growth, restrict movement, and create a sense of being stuck between what was and what could be. Colette avoids this by making deliberate choices about what to keep and what to transform. She does not rush the process, but she does not avoid it either. She engages with it thoughtfully, step by step. As her project develops, the connection between past and present becomes more visible. The container, once an empty and discarded structure, begins to reflect her understanding, her effort, and her history. It becomes a space where her past and present coexist. The materials, the design, the work itself, all of it carries traces of where she has been while also pointing toward where she is going. This integration is what gives the space its depth. It is not just a new creation. It is a continuation of a longer story. The response from others further reinforces this idea. People are drawn to the space not just because of its appearance, but because of what it represents. There is a sense of authenticity in it, a feeling that it has been created with intention and care. This authenticity comes from the fact that it is rooted in something real, something lived. Colette is not trying to replicate a style or follow a trend. She is expressing something that has developed over time, shaped by experience and refined through practice. In this way, moving forward becomes an act of respect rather than abandonment. It acknowledges that the past has value, but also recognizes that value is not limited to a single moment or form. It can evolve, expand, and find new expressions. Colette's life after Raymond is not a replacement for what they had together. It is a continuation of it, adapted to new circumstances and shaped by her own choices. This perspective also changes how we think about grief. Instead of viewing it as something that must be overcome or left behind, it can be seen as something that becomes part of the ongoing experience. It does not disappear, but it changes. It becomes less about absence and more about connection, less about what is missing and more about what remains. Colette's relationship with her grief reflects this shift. It is still present, but it no longer defines her actions. It exists alongside her work, her decision, her daily life. Over time, this approach creates a sense of continuity. The line between past and present becomes less rigid. Instead of being divided by a single moment of loss, her life becomes a continuous thread, with different phases connected by shared meaning. This continuity makes it possible to move forward without feeling disconnected from what came before. It allows for growth without requiring a complete break from the past. There is also a practical aspect to this idea. By carrying forward what she has learned and experienced, Colette is able to build something that is both new and familiar. She does not have to start from scratch. She builds on a foundation that already exists, adapting it to fit her current situation. This makes the process more sustainable and more grounded. It reduces the need for drastic change and allows for gradual development. In the end, what Colette demonstrates is that moving forward does not mean leaving everything behind. It means choosing what to carry with you and how to carry it. It means recognizing that the past is not a weight that must be dropped, but a resource that can be used. It means allowing love, experience, and memory to continue shaping your life in ways that are active and meaningful. The moral is simple but often overlooked. True strength lies not in holding on or letting go, but in knowing how to transform what you have lived into something that allows you to keep living with purpose and meaning. Disclaimer: this story is meant for inspiration and reflection. While it highlights resilience and transformation, real-life situations vary and outcomes may differ. Financial decisions, personal loss, and life changes should always be approached thoughtfully and, when needed, with professional guidance.